Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. For those looking at us on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host and my friend, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing great, Will. Thanks.
Wonderful. And this week we have with us Congressman Jared Huffman. He represents California's 2nd Congressional District, which spans the north coast of the state from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Oregon border. He sits on multiple caucuses to include the Congressional Freethought Caucus, and I plan on asking you a lot about that. But before I do, I want to welcome you to the show. So welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Welcome.
And while I think the caucus does have forethought, we call it the Freethought Caucus.
Freethought. Interesting. Oh. That's so weird. What's,
That's good. I like that.
Yeah. I wonder what I was thinking about. Anyways, I want to ask you just real briefly about 2 other caucuses I saw that you're a part of, because it sort of I don't know, excited me that maybe I should become a congressperson. So like, you are on the ski and snowboard caucus and the small brewers caucus. Like, what are those about?
Those are great names for caucuses that do nothing and never meet. So, if that sounds like work that you would like to do, come to Congress and join those caucuses.
That's awesome. Oh yeah. Okay. So Freethought Caucus. What is sort of the purpose, the basis? Who else sits on the caucus? Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah. So, Will, the Freethought Caucus is a very different type of caucus. And, there are dozens and dozens of caucuses. You mentioned a few that are sort of in name only. Freethought Caucus is a working caucus. And we are a group now up to 22 members. Unfortunately,
Wow.
All Democrats at this point. We would love for it to be bipartisan. We would love for it to be bicameral. But we focus very much on defending the separation of church and state. We focus on what we believe is true religious liberty, which is defending everybody's right to believe whatever they want or to not believe whatever they want. So we want to maintain a secular, pluralistic republic and also defend both religious minorities and non-believers against discrimination in the U.S. and around the world, because as you probably know, that's a big deal in lots of places.
Absolutely. Well, that's so cool. Thank you so much for explaining that. Yeah, the Freethought Caucus. I'm like, that would be awesome. If I'm ever congressman, I'd love to join that caucus. And I'm a Republican, so hey, maybe out there in the universe sometime you'll have one. I'll be able to join. But
I would love it.
That would be great. So, I'm a pastor and I'm super religious, one of those religious, conservative, evangelical freaks, that everyone loves. And one of my questions, though, can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing and faith journey and, of course, non-faith journey, however that works? And feel free to share whatever you're comfortable sharing and not whatever you don't want to. So I just love to hear a little bit more about that.
The pastor parishioner privilege, I assume, Josh.
Exactly.
I'm always happy to talk about it because it's been an interesting journey. I grew up in a branch of the Mormon church. So I grew up in Independence, Missouri. And for folks that know Mormon theology, that's a really significant place. It's a place where the founding prophet of the Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith, had a revelation that told him that that's where the original Garden of Eden was in Jackson County, Missouri. Most people don't appreciate that. So lucky me, I was born in the site of the original Garden of Eden.
Come on, somebody.
But it was also a prophecy that the saints would build Zion in Independence, Missouri. And so it became a very significant place for Mormon history. Of course, there were new revelations that came along with Brigham Young, and eventually Salt Lake City became the new Zion. But a branch had split off after Joseph Smith was killed, and it became the Reorganized Latter-day Saints. Joseph Smith's young son, Joseph Smith III, eventually became the prophet, and they did put their world headquarters in Independence, and that's the church I grew up in, the Reorganized Latter-day Saints. I was very active. My church community and theology were my whole life. And I was a member of the priesthood up until I was about 20 or so in college. It kind of fell apart for me, and I left the church and spent a few decades drifting around and have eventually landed as a secular humanist. And so I'm
All
happy to
right.
discuss any or all of that and more with you, but that's probably more of my religious background than you bargained for.
Appreciate
Yeah,
you sharing.
yeah, I think that's great. So by the time folks are watching this, the president would have given his State of the Union address. In his speech, he said that the State of the Union is strong. I'd love to get your thoughts on what is the state of religious liberty in the United States.
I think we're struggling to answer that question, Will. And I think we're at a moment where we just have different ideas of what religious liberty is. There are some people who think religious liberty is their deeply held religious beliefs that need to be institutionalized and imposed society-wide on everyone, whether they hold them or not. And that's creating some real fissures, I think, in our
Mm.
democracy, in our political landscape, and I think even among Christians. My guest last night at the State of the Union, and I don't want to speak for Christians, that would be pretty presumptuous of me. I'll let Josh do that. But my guest at the State of the Union was a woman that you may know of, Amanda Tyler from the Baptist Joint Committee on
Yep.
Civil Liberties. She has started an organization called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. My point in bringing Amanda as my guest was to show that some of the best advocates right now against Christian nationalists are Christians, sincere
Absolutely.
Christians who oppose it from that perspective. So it's not just non-believers like me and secularists and others who are non-Christians. It includes a growing number of actual bona fide Christians.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Amanda was wonderful. She was a guest on our show. It was shortly after the Kennedy v. Bremerton, Supreme Court thing was decided. So, and yeah, she's wonderful. I guess maybe my question. So, as a city member of Congress, how does one go about thinking about legislation, while also keep it in mind, religious liberty? Because it seems like, religion is such an integral part to people's lives in America. And it seems like you can't really pass a bill without offending somebody, especially when it comes to religion. So what's that sort of delicate balance that you have to be thinking about?
Well, I certainly don't ever want to do anything that infringes on true religious liberty. But I think it's important for everyone to remember that religious liberty is liberty in the broadest sense, right? It means that you get to believe whatever you want and practice your religion in your personal life in any way that you want, except if it comes to the point of infringing on other people's rights. And you don't get to bring your religion into the public square and institutionalize it in our government. That's a red line. That's why we have an establishment clause. And, sometimes these days it feels like we're relitigating this foundational issue that our founders, struggled with, but it really wasn't much of a struggle. They made kind of a no-brainer decision to reject theocracy. And they had plenty of theocratic models to choose from if they wanted to go down that road, right? Because you guys know what it was like in colonial America, and the Puritans did nasty things to the Quakers and their theocracy, and all sorts of crazy authoritarian things happened in the theocratic models that we had before we created our constitutional republic. We made a break from that, a very deliberate one, and it seems that these days, some people, there was controversy even back then. There were faith leaders who wrote to Madison and Jefferson and others and said, you should have embedded Christianity as a national religion. You should have mentioned God, should have mentioned Jesus in the Constitution. And they pushed back and said, no, we are drawing a hard line of separation between church and state here. But a lot of people have never accepted it. And there's been this Christian nationalist impulse that sort of comes up every so often. And right now we're living through one of those moments where that impulse is presenting itself in a big way.
Yeah, I completely understand what you're saying. To my own potential, detriment, I am one of those Christians. And I say that because there are people that have been potentially on a support team for my church. There are people that I know and love dearly. There are people that would listen to this and feel like I'm not a Christian or I'm not a good Christian, because I am one of those Christians that said Christian nationalism is a danger and a terrible, terrible idea. And it's interesting because you have to kind of define terms, especially when it comes to something like this. And we have talked about this a lot, but I'm happy we've talked about it a lot because it is such a crucial issue right now. And it's doing as much damage to the church, in my opinion, as it's doing to our nation. And I would love to get your kind of take. What is Christian nationalism as you understand it? And why is it such a big deal? How is it affecting our politics today? And kind of give your take on all that.
Yeah, well, first, thank you, Josh, for having the courage to tackle the subject. Honestly, from your perspective as a Christian, I think that's so important. And there really is an interfaith alliance on this issue that is good for both our constitutional republic and the democratic values we should all care about, and also good for religion. This is something that, Madison and our founders were really emphatic about. This decision to separate church and state was not an anti-religion decision. They thought it was in the best interests of religion to be divorced from government in that way. So I'm so glad that you and others get that. So I guess defining Christian nationalism is itself a subject that you could probably have an entire podcast on. The most typical shorthand definition is the fusion of Christian identity with right-wing political identity, so that kind of right-wing politics and right-wing conservative Christianity become one and the same thing. And the only way to be a true American under that worldview is to be a religious conservative. And so that's sort of the most frequent shorthand definition that I hear. Some people will add to that there's sort of a white Christian nationalism element to it, that this is part of a broader kind of white Christian privilege culture war fight that we're having. And there certainly are a lot of non-religious people, certainly people that don't go to church, have probably never read the Bible, that are Christian nationalists, right? And so it's not simple to even define the subject, but it's kind of like all of these things and more. And the reason that white comes into the conversation quite a bit is that there's a black Christian nationalism that's very different than the Christian nationalism that I think we're talking about here today. Black Christian nationalism is a sort of, within the black church, as I understand it, a national pride that kind of revolves around voting and civic responsibility. It's pretty darn consistent with our democratic values and our Constitution. The flip side of that is, much more of a Christian nationalism that is about a white agenda, a Christian supremacy that is not at all like what the black church talks about.
Yeah, that's really really good. I appreciate you kind of helping unpack that. I'm reluctant to somewhat push back on your definition a little bit, just because I'm in the middle of reading Brian Kaler. He's a good friend of the pod. He's coming out with a book called Baptizing America. The beginning of this book is actually really, really good. And he sort of makes this comparison about the Democrats using sort of, very Christian related terms and stuff, specifically like after January 6th, to kind of say that, Christian nationalism's a big issue. It seems very prominent in conservative type circles, but it's like Democrats, don't necessarily have their hands clean kind of completely on this issue. And it hurts because like I'm a Democrat, and I feel like we're flawless, right? So, so like, are there permutations of Christian nationalism that seem to kind of transcend party lines or Christian nationalist, activities? So like, and I'll just use one example, like, Biden going to the church in South Carolina, and talking about, not giving a sermon, but talking about primarily just political stuff.
Well, I don't mean to suggest that we have to sort of purge civic engagement and patriotism and all these things from our culture centers, including churches. I mean, I would never suggest that. I think where we get into trouble is not when a president goes to a black church and speaks to them as he hopefully would any gathering of people, including in a mosque or a synagogue or a group of secularists. I think where we get into trouble is when we start trying to take religious dogma and doctrine and institutionalize it in our government. And so, I'm not terribly troubled when I see a president in a black church, or even when I see, my Republican friends going to their churches and engaging with those folks. Those are their constituents, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was listening to a book that came out. Well, it was a lecture on a book that came out by a guy named Paul Miller called The Religion of American Greatness. We had a guest that kind of recommended to it. We're trying to see if we can get him on the show to talk to him. But he really made an amazing comparison to me. He said the analogy is, that Christian nationalism kind of sees, like nationalism sees cultures like a checkerboard, and each little space is very well defined. So you have your French space, you have your German space, you have your Anglo space, you have all these things. It's like, and it's like culture is like a Venn diagram where everyone's kind of like, there's overlap and there's back and forth, and there's some things that are more, in this culture, and there's some things that are more defined in another culture. And I would see, like, even secularism, like if you were to sit here and you were to define the tenets of human secularism, secular humanism, right? And I probably would agree with a lot that you said and be like, oh man, I like that value. That's a value I feel like is a Christian value, or I guess it's a multiple value. I don't know what to call it. But like when you're approaching legislation and when you're looking at like how to best form these kinds of laws that will include the most amount of people, how has your secularism, the human secularism, helped you in that? And do you think in any ways it might hinder or like there are obstacles that you might have to overcome, especially thinking about maybe how religious people might view or take this particular piece of legislation?
Yeah, well, there's a lot in that question, Josh. I hope
I know I gave you a softball. I just wanted
to. Yeah. For starters, I hope that I am never insensitive to people's sincerely held religious beliefs.
Sure.
The last thing in the world I want to do is judge or insult or anything else in this space of belief, which is so personal. And also so diverse, right? And we should never presume to really know what is in someone else's heart when it comes to things like that. But I think we each bring our own values to life and to the work that we do. I guess I grew up as a Christian, and, you might say that my values are Christian values, even though I'm a non-believer today and a humanist.
Sure.
It's not like my values changed. But I guess I would also say that a lot of these values are really universal and don't depend on, some verse in the Bible. I would say love thy neighbor was around a lot longer than, when Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. And I would say that some of the golden rule was around as part of a universal value, part of human nature, long before, Moses descended from Mount Sinai with tablets, if you believe that. So I just tend to look at it that way when you think of basic decency and goodness and humanity. And you're right. I think you would look down the list of values that define humanism, and you would probably agree with almost all of them, because they're universal. And it's just about being a good, decent human being, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, like I guess to piggyback on that, how do you like balance, religious liberty and like civil rights? Because it seems like when you're talking about religious freedom, there always seems to kind of be that tension. So if you think about COVID, church closings, for instance, people with churches would say, yeah, you can't tell me to close my church, but from a public health standpoint, we're like, it's probably going to be the best for everybody. Or when you think about like, the web designer Supreme Court case that they didn't want to make a website
Yeah.
for a made up gay couple because it wasn't really like a real person there. But
Right.
so how do you sort of walk that tight line, and how do you handle that tension between the two?
Well, I'm going to have a very different answer than, some religionists would give you in that. But I just don't think you can impose your religious values on everyone else, whether or not they believe in them. And I think it's as simple as that. So we are living through a time right now when many of my Republican friends are trying to legislate in ways, and people are doing it in courts and in judicial decisions as well, that basically give a special exemption, a special free pass for people to discriminate and do all of these other things that would be illegal if applied to everyone else, if it's part of a sincerely held religious belief. I mean, you just saw Justice Alito in a Supreme Court, I think it was a concurring opinion he just made about a juror who was dismissed because of homophobic views they expressed in the process of jury selection that they said were religious beliefs. And Alito was very disturbed that this person could be bounced from a jury because their religion tells them to be homophobic. Well, if that was relevant to the case, they should be bounced, and there shouldn't be a special set of rules that says you have to blind yourself to discrimination and to other illegal conduct if someone says, oh, but my religion tells me I need to do this. I think that's BS, frankly. And frankly, I think a lot of Christians and other religionists would agree with me, and they don't bring that kind of scorched earth, religious agenda into public policy, but some do.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. It is like interesting because trying to find that line where here are my beliefs, like we were mentioning, like universal, like kind of universal beliefs. And I guess, how do you figure out if something is universal? Like for you, like how do you figure out like, hey, this is a value that is going to be accepted because, it's basically, it's so either good or on the other side, it's so obviously bad,
right?
That this is we can say that this is universal, like the majority of this is going to represent the majority of Americans. And I'll just give you a little bit of context because I've always struggled with this. I've always wrestled with this, even just as a Christian. And I've done a lot of thinking, and I've really, my views have evolved way more than I ever thought they would. My views have, I'm still a very strong Christian. I still believe in Christ and his atoning work and what he did and all of that as a pastor. But one thing I wonder about, you look at laws and you look at like, say, like the 10 Commandments versus like other laws that were in the ancient Near East at the time. And again, I'm not expecting you to be an expert in ancient Near Eastern law or anything like that. I'm just saying, like, you look at some of these things and you see this kind of, okay, that makes sense. Like, and so we don't have murder and we define murder in a certain way. And I hear a lot, well, we can't legislate morality, but it seems to me we legislate morality all the time when we're trying to help mitigate, behavior. So I don't know, like, I guess it's more even like from your heart, how have you wrestled through some of these, like how we universalize these laws and make them applicable to the widest amount of people?
It's a great question and a really thoughtful way of posing it. There are some things that are easier to sort of call universal values, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Be nice to people, the stuff they teach you in kindergarten, and tell the truth, and don't steal, and don't kill anyone. Yeah, I mean, those are the easy ones, but you're absolutely right. You're going to get into areas of disagreement, things that I might consider universal that maybe a Republican conservative Christian would disagree with, and certainly vice versa, because I think Speaker Mike Johnson, for example, would consider his biblically based expansive definition of life to be a universal value, certainly within his worldview and his community. And I disagree completely that that's a universal value. So, I don't have a definitive answer to that tough question you've posed. I just think
I understand.
we can at least work in that space where all of us as human beings who learned the basics in kindergarten ought to be able to regard some things as universal, and then probably have some healthy debate about the rest. But yeah, do we legislate morality? To some degree, we do, but we should try to legislate the morality that we share universally, as universally as possible, and not try to pick these divisive, extreme things that some might believe are important moral codes, but most of us don't. And this is where the culture war just pits us against each other right now, because on this issue of life and abortion, the majority of Americans do not think it's immoral for women to make healthcare decisions about their own bodies. They think it's really important that they have that right. And Speaker Johnson and many of my colleagues across the aisle feel just the opposite.
Yeah, it's hard for me to believe that you are like one of the only secularists in Congress. So can you maybe like give me a little bit more hope about sort of like where people stand on religious liberty within Congress? You don't have to name names, but help me better understand sort of like people's religious backgrounds in Congress.
Yeah, I will give you some hope here, Will. You came to the right place. And it starts with this group that I founded with Jamie Raskin called the Congressional Freethought Caucus. Now, I want to be clear, it's not a bunch of infidels and non-believers like me. It includes plenty of people of faith. It's a group that 22 members now that looks a lot like America. So we have Christians, we have Jews, we have Muslims, we have Hindus, we have a Buddhist. We have some Unitarians. I mean, they can be whatever you want, right? And you got me, the token humanist in the United States Congress. Out of 535 members of Congress, I'm the only one dumb enough to publicly say that I don't have a religious belief.
That's amazing.
So it's a really eclectic group, but I'll tell you what unifies us is this issue of defending our secular government and defending what we think is true religious liberty.
So on the Freethought Caucus, what are some of the initiatives or goals that you all hope to achieve by meeting and discussing these issues?
Yeah, so it varies with each session of Congress. We try to lay out priorities, but you're going to find us working on all sorts of interesting things. We have gone after blasphemy laws, which is really a nasty, pernicious thing if you care about true religious liberty. Yeah. We file amicus briefs in cases that go to the Supreme Court, usually for us to lose these days when it comes to defining religious liberty. We are very active right now on this issue of Christian nationalism and trying to really educate our colleagues in Congress, congressional staff, the media, and others about what's going on. Our Freethought Caucus was the first to sound the alarm about Christian nationalism as a national security threat a few months before the January 6th insurrection. We had a woman named Catherine Stewart, who you may know of. She's an investigative journalist who's written an important book called Power Worshippers. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So she came and spoke to us in the fall of 2020, before the election, actually in the summer, and helped us begin to highlight this issue. Jamie Raskin and I then wrote a memo to the incoming Biden administration. We were concerned enough at what Catherine Stewart had told us that we warned him, you need to take this seriously as a national security threat. But we're really just beginning, I think, to get people talking about this. The Alabama IVF decision has definitely opened a window to talk about it a little more candidly than we have in the past. But we got a long way to go. And the Freethought Caucus is really the vanguard of this conversation within Congress.
That's really cool. I need you to tell me more about these blasphemy laws. Like, can you give us some examples?
Yes, please.
You don't want to run afoul of one of these?
No. Do not.
Yeah. So for the most part, they haven't been enforced for the last 100 years because courts were starting to, rule in an obvious way. They're unconstitutional. And so I think the last one that tried to enforce it was Pennsylvania, and a court ruled that that's a violation of the First Amendment. But there are at least a half dozen states in America that still have blasphemy laws on the books. And I'll surprise you with one, Massachusetts. All right.
No.
So,
Really?
Massachusetts General Law 30, Section 36, you can look it up. All the way back from the Massachusetts Bay Colony Puritan era Salem witch trial days. That's what this
Wow.
law, that's the provenance of this law. And you read it and you just can't even believe it's on the books of the state of Massachusetts right now in the year 2024. But it's all right there. Whoever, casts aspersions on God or Jesus is guilty of this crime.
Wow, that's amazing. It's amazing. It's like those, have you heard those weird like laws where like someone can like beat, someone up on the steps of the court, like on 3 p.m. on Tuesdays? It kind of reminds me, like in some laws or jurisdictions, they have these ancient, antiquated that no one ever, right? But then they're still on the books.
Yeah.
Because why? Because if they tried to get them off, you'd have someone going up in arms. And why can't we get back to the old days, the good old days, where we could get to the court steps at 2 p.m.? Sorry.
You would think it would be pretty non-controversial to just repeal some of these old anachronisms, but you would have to have somebody on from Massachusetts to tell you why that law is still on the book. And of course, in the United States, this is a dead letter, right? Nobody's enforcing these laws. Not so in other places around the world, where
Yes.
particularly in Islamic countries and other theocracies, blasphemy laws are a big deal, and people are executed for violating them.
Yes.
So it's a very serious subject.
Oh, I know it is. I know it is. And I definitely hear what you're saying there. I got to ask about this next upcoming 2024 election. How are you feeling about this? What's the buzz in Congress that we're going to have the same two people, the same two guys up there? I mean, I could ask you about what you think about, and again, anything you want edited out. We're not like, the right and, or left, like media where we're going to catch you and then we're going to blast it out. We edit things out that people, if they didn't wish they didn't say that or whatever.
You're not supposed to say that on air.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Josh, you got to know, you're not talking to a super careful politician. Otherwise, I would have continued ducking questions about my religion. And
I hear you.
I was
dumb
dumb
enough. What do you think? I mean, how can it be? What's going on here? And like, I just would love to hear your thoughts on this upcoming election and what you're concerned about.
The rematch that no one in America wanted?
Yeah.
Well, it is what it is. And this is not the first time in my life where, I have been presented with a choice that is not the one I would have ideally preferred, right? And so I think now that the die is cast and this is what we're going to see on our November ballot, it's time for people to just make a choice. And whether you like that choice or not, it is going to affect you and this planet and your family and your kids and grandkids in a profound way. So, I don't spend too much time lamenting the fact that Joe Biden has, physically slowed down and, stumbles once in a while or commits gaffes, like he always has. I look at the policies, I look at the good work that he's done, and I look at the alternative. And as much as, I would love to be voting for JFK or Barack Obama this fall, that's not the choice I get to make. But I will choose Joe Biden every day of the week over the alternative.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. You're preaching to the proverbial, choir here. And I'm curious, somewhat afraid that if Trump gets elected again, all the work that the Freethought Caucus has done is probably going to go to the wayside, especially if you take into consideration like the Project 2025, that 900-page manifesto that really sort of seeks to change sort of like our democracy pretty fundamentally. I mean, there's stuff in there like, working on the Sabbath, and stuff like that. So I'd love to just get your thoughts if you're familiar with Project 2025 and what.
All too familiar, and it's chilling. And yeah, some of the definitions of things that would be deemed pornographic and banned and illegal and criminalized, uh, the chilling effect that it would have on this country, in service of again that Christian nationalist agenda. In the case of this transphobic and homophobic policy that they're trying to embed in Project 2025. There's all kinds of reasons. The elimination of safeguards, checks and balances, so that we can just kind of cut through all the chaos they've created and get right to a fascist theocracy. That's what I see in the shadows of Project 2025, and I'm certainly not the only one to see it that way. So the stakes are super high. Will the Freethought Caucus be irrelevant if Donald Trump somehow wins? I mean, I don't like to think about that scenario at all, but I would tell you that probably for the first few months, we would be more relevant than ever, because we've been sounding the alarm against this agenda way before anyone else was. And I think we would try to step our game up as much as possible to make sure that America and any people of good conscience that are still left in the Congress know what is happening, because we could lose it all when it comes to democracy, separation of church and state, and other values. I hope we don't ever get to that point. But I guess I would say, even if Biden prevails, which I hope he does, these issues are going to continue to be hugely important, because this movement, this Christian nationalist movement, is not going away. They have sort of tasted power in the first four years of the Trump administration. And anyone who thought that after January 6th, they sort of, got their comeuppance and went away, is not paying attention, because they are stronger than ever. They are more mobilized than ever. They are more determined than ever to lock in this theocracy agenda of theirs. And even if Biden manages to prevail, they're going to keep coming.
I gotta, and this is going to be a slight shift in topic, but it's still very relevant. How do you, what I wanted to ask actually originally was, what's the most important thing that Congress needs to do, if Biden wins and if Trump wins? And maybe they're the same thing, but with somehow this came out of that, and you can answer those or not. But this idea of what do you think about AI? What does Congress need to do in any legislation, given the pervasiveness of this artificial intelligence now in our society? That's not going anywhere. That can give any bias that's made and put in the creators of these things can be amplified 1,000,000 times, right? By these bots that never sleep, and they continue. And again, I try not to be like, I try not to have my tinfoil hat on. I try not to be a conspiracy theorist, but I don't think this is conspiracy in the sense of what is the benefit that you see, and what are the really serious concerns that you see that Congress needs to address regarding
Well, I
this?
did not expect to answer a question about artificial intelligence on your podcast, but I'm happy to free associate with you on this. And
Yes.
I will just tell you that I think Congress, you don't want Congress to kind of get into the weeds and micromanage in this space. I don't think we would anyway. But I think Congress has to look at some of the worst possible uses of this technology, and put some sideboards in place. And that's where you alluded to a couple of them. One is the sort of inherent bias in the development of artificial intelligence, to try to make sure that at least the input that goes into these AI technologies is not stacked with some, racial, ethnic, political, or other agenda that is going to corrupt the way it's used. Obviously, in the national security space and the privacy space and other things, we've got all kinds of ways in which we need to protect against bad outcomes. I don't think we ever want to see artificial intelligence making life and death decisions about, how a weapon targets someone in any capacity, really.
Yes.
So, that's another example of where we can put some sideboards and laws in place and begin to have a lot more oversight and accountability. But right now we have none of it. So you're absolutely right that it is here, it is upon us. The other way I'm worrying about AI is the energy demand. I just read a piece yesterday about how, it's so computer intensive, so energy intensive to crunch all of this data and produce these results that now we're using in an almost routine way with Chat GPT, with AI things happening in the background that we don't even know about. All of it is just doubling, tripling, quadrupling electrical demand in some parts of the country in ways that grid operators didn't see coming. And it's on the verge of crashing our kind of creaky old electrical grid. So it's forcing us to rethink our grid, rethink our grid planning and permitting and approval and our energy mix. We have these climate goals. We're trying to save the planet for our kids and grandkids by rapidly transitioning to clean energy. But the combination of the strain on the grid and just the need for those electrical demands is going to really frustrate us. And, I see the same thing when it comes to cryptocurrency, which I regard as a solution in search of a problem. But it depending on the type of crypto, if it's this proof of work version of it versus proof of concept, I don't want to take you down the rabbit hole too much further.
But I understand, yeah.
It can have a massive energy demand and can have some of these same effects. So we're going to have to reconcile our climate and energy policies with some of these technologies that left, unregulated are going to do a lot of harm societally and environmentally.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because, I've known people and know people that, they're building crypto farms that are going to other countries to build crypto farms. And it's going to take all of this energy, right? And AI is all a part of that. And just like this quick concern, like, do you think, and this is kind of tongue in cheek, so answer it however you want, but do you think that we have like congressional staff members using ChatGPT to write legislation? And is there like, I'm just trying to really figure this out. Like, what does that mean? Because I get these laws, they're huge. And it's like, how do we even understand this? And is it just going to be like chatbots writing legislation for chatbots, and then we got to figure out what they're doing? A little tongue in cheek there, but do you think people are you disallowed from using it?
Yeah, well, technically, I think our staff is not supposed to use it for any of the documents. Any of the work they do for me had better not be ChatGPT. And I don't think it is. But yeah, would I be shocked to hear that congressional staffers are out using ChatGPT, maybe not on their official congressional computers, maybe at home or whatever, to produce the letters to constituents? And of course, it's going to be the same for congressional staffers as college students writing their, term papers and other things. This is tempting and inviting, and we're going to have to figure all of this out in the brave new world.
That's so funny. I will disclose that I use ChatGPT to help me sort through a lot of these bills because I'm that type of voter that likes to actually read the bills and whatnot. And then when AI came along, I can just upload the whole thing and then just ask it questions, which is wonderful. Which if you're watching or listening, like to be more engaged in the political system, I encourage everybody to do that. So,
but the flip side of this, though, guys, is sometimes I have to give what we call 1-minute speeches on the floor, and if I have a very junior staff or an intern or someone like that writing a 1-minute speech that I've got to go deliver without a lot of time to review it and edit it and work on it, the quality is often better from ChatGPT. I have seen what ChatGPT can do. And, I don't mean to invite anyone in Congress to do this, but
I get it.
I've gotten some real junk in my hand that I'm supposed to go stand on the floor of the Congress and read as a speech. And I'm not sure that I wouldn't trade that for a well-done ChatGPT product.
I understand.
That's so funny. We talked to a lot of professors on this show, and occasionally we'll bring that up. Like I'd hate to be a professor during this time, because like we didn't have to. I had to actually read books when I was in college. I didn't get the summary, but anyways, I wanna sort of like course
Yes.
correct.
And let me say 99% of my staff draft speeches are excellent. So lest any of my staff listen to this and take offense, you know.
That's awesome. So you mentioned earlier about Catherine Stewart coming to warn you about Christian nationalism. She's great, by the way. We've had her on the show a couple times, and I love to kind of get your thoughts about the Christian nationalism influences that you saw on January 6th, because I think for a lot of people, especially folks that don't really like follow this space very closely,
Yep.
they just think, oh, there's just some made up liberal scare tactic, to ostracize all Christians or something. So I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, just use your lion eyes and take a look at what was going on January 6th. You don't need to believe me. You don't need to believe Catherine Stewart or anyone else. Just look at the footage, the symbology, the slogans, the outpouring of religiosity in the Capitol mob that day was undeniable. It was everywhere. The appeal to heaven flags that were being used to crash through the Capitol doors and windows and beat cops over the head, and other Christian flags and symbols and Bibles held aloft by rioters that were doing all of the worst violence. The grotesque prayer on the Senate floor by the QAnon shaman. I could go on and on, but the truth is that insurrection was just seething with Christian nationalism. Some of the leading Christian nationalist faith leaders were on site, were preaching from just a few feet away from this riot as it was unfolding. There were hymns and shofars were blowing. It was a Christian nationalist production in many ways. Not that there weren't others involved in the riot too, but even the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers knelt in Christian prayer, performative Christian prayer, and like streamed it and stuff. So I don't mean this is not anti-Christian to point these things out. It's just kind of pro-reality of what actually happened that day. And we need to talk about it more, because the January 6th committee, for all of its great work in preserving the history of that day, how it was planned and executed, what happened, they said almost nothing about Christian nationalism. I think they had a 150 or so page report, and Christian nationalism appears, I believe, only once, when they mentioned that Nick Fuentes, one of the plotters of the insurrection, held extreme violent Christian nationalist views, and that's about it. Now, I know for a fact that members of that committee and staff, and the record that they had to work with, the depositions and other things, were filled with information that pointed to Christian nationalism as a big part of the January 6th insurrection. A political decision was made to not talk about it. And I think that's a problem. And I think it's part of a problem we continue to encounter in this space. No one wants to be accused of being anti-Christian. No one wants to face the kind of backlash that comes when you speak out on this subject. And if you want a great example, talk to Politico reporter Heidi Persbala right now, who has been catching hell from Tony Perkins and others on the Christian right because she dared to speak out against Christian nationalism in a TV interview. So it's not for the faint of heart to go in and criticize this movement. It's why I really commend you guys for having the guts to talk honestly about it. It's why I'm just a huge fan of faith leaders like Amanda Tyler, who also have the courage to talk about it.
Yeah, that brings up a really interesting point, because one of my questions is like, how do you tackle Christian nationalism? I mean, it's just like, it's an ideology for some, maybe it's even a theology. And how do you can't like write a law that bans Christian nationalism, and maybe rightly, I say that somewhat, like somewhat lightly, in the sense that you can't, if you are trying to get rid of Christian nationalism, you're going to ostracize Christians like Josh, like myself, because
Yeah,
yeah, because
that is the delicate balance. I think you framed it just right. How do you do that without disrespecting Christians? And I have my own thoughts about that. I'm a non-believer, so what I do and say in this space may be indelicate. It may not be deferential enough. But it's why advocates like Amanda Tyler are so important. And she's not the only one. You guys know this. There's a growing number of sincere, serious Christians that are tackling this from a Christian perspective. And when they do, it's just harder for the Christian nationalists to use their kind of go-to playbook, calling them persecutors and anti-Christians.
Yeah, so I'm a patriot, and I always have been, and I am thankful for the influence that this country has had on me. And I have always kind of felt like, I just love this country so much. I love the American experiment of trying to have this, constitutional republic and make it happen. And the way that we've had such diversity in this country is amazing. And I'm a very, very strong Christian. And I want to preserve both of those things. And I would love to hear from you, like for guys like me and for guys that, guys that are way already on the edge. They're at January 6th. I'm not saying that, they're beyond the pale or anything like that. I would sit down and have a conversation with one of them and talk to them and love them personally as a brother or sister in Christ. As a congressman, what do you want guys like me and to the right of me to hear from you about this next election season, the future of our country? What appeal do you want to make that's worth thinking about this, thinking about our votes, thinking about using our influence, as patriots and Christians? How do you want us to be involved? What's your appeal to the people I represent?
Well, thanks. I guess for starters, I would hope we can all agree that political violence or religious violence needs to be off the table. We need to condemn it.
Yes.
We need to not incite it. And this is where, a lot of the New Apostolic Reformation, apostles and prophets and other Christian nationalist leaders, I believe, have really crossed a line. Now, they would tell you we didn't tell anyone to go hurt people. We didn't tell anyone to crash through the Capitol. But they walked right up to that line with their rhetoric. It was so incendiary, so combustible. When they talked to people about getting their swords bloody like folks from the Old Testament in some great battle, it's not subtle what they're telling people. And they can say, well, we didn't say go engage in violence, but really they are saying it in lots of ways. And we cannot give religious cover to violence. And I would hope that that's something that all of us can take out to our communities and networks. Beyond that, Josh, I think it's important to affirm that no one is trying to deny the profound influence Christianity has had on this country, societally, culturally, historically. It's obviously an essential part of the belief system that has dominated our history and our culture and still does. So, I feel like so much of this culture war and the political manifestation of the culture war comes from this feeling that someone's trying to take that away from us. And, I think it's important to say that I don't think that's happening. I think this is additive. I think, yes, our country is diversifying. It's becoming more secular. Things are changing, but no one's taken anything away. It's a little bit like me as a white guy, right? Patriarchy's had a pretty darn good run for a long time. But I am comfortable with my fading patriarchy. Nobody's taking anything away from me. It just means maybe it's time for, indigenous people and people of color and women and people with disabilities and others to have a fair shake. And I just hope that we can come to look at things that way, a little more tolerantly, a little more inclusively. Doesn't mean we're taking anything away from those who have been part of the dominant culture for so long.
That's really great. Yeah, there's a great saying, that when you're in the majority, equality feels like oppression, right? So that definitely seems like to be the case here. So my last question for you, Congressman, is tell us about the future. Like what are some things that make you hopeful? What are some things that you're working on that maybe you want to give some daylight to? And maybe what can people expect from a religious liberty standpoint if Trump gets elected again?
Yeah, look, I don't want to sugarcoat it. Well, I'm real worried about the future when it comes to religious liberty. And some of that is regardless of how this presidential election comes out, because this Supreme Court is hardwired toward an agenda that is going to continue to essentially write the Establishment Clause out of the Constitution. They just think pretty much to enforce the Establishment Clause is to violate the Free Exercise Clause. And I think it's a complete misread. I think it has all sorts of terrible consequences for separation of church and state, but you're going to continue to see terrible decisions from them. You're probably going to see them, recognize a parochial Catholic public school in Oklahoma, or one of these other things, these cases that just keep filtering up to them, and they keep taking review because they want to tear down the separation of church and state and advance this extreme agenda. So I'm really worried about where these court decisions are going to take us. I'm really worried about how divided our country is. If this were just a question of Congress fixing bad court decisions, it's not that simple when we're as divided as we are, and Congress keeps flipping back and forth in this, all or nothing, zero-sum fight we seem to be in. So none of it, bodes well for thoughtful, resolutions that are consensus-based. But the fight is super important for those of us who believe in these values. And so, I got to believe we will prevail. The hope is in the younger generation. And the fact that they want nothing to do with this stupid culture war. They're just done with it. And they care about climate change, and they really, I think, are the best hope that we have. We just got to make sure we don't screw everything up before they, get into power.
That's so awesome. When we spoke with Tim Alberta, I had asked him a similar question about kind of like what gives him hope, and he said something very similar. He's like, young people, give him a lot of hope, which is good. I mean, like it's good to have hope whether you are a believer or not believer. So, I think that's a really good place to end our discussion. So thank you so much, Congressman, for coming to join us on our show. This has been a amazing, great. It was a really good conversation, and I really enjoyed talking to you.
Well, it was a pleasure. You guys have a great podcast. I've enjoyed listening to it, and I hope you'll have me back sometime.
Yeah, we'll do.
Absolutely. That was awesome.
To our listeners and audience, make sure you keep your conversations not right, not left, but up, and we'll see you next week. Take care.